The newsroom was in turmoil. Producers huddled in frantic discussions, interns darted between offices with hastily printed statements, and the front desk phone rang ceaselessly. At the center of the chaos stood James Caldwell, a well-known liberal TV host, pacing his dressing room, his phone vibrating relentlessly with calls and notifications. Just hours ago, he had been the star of the network's primetime political talk show. Now his career was crumbling before his eyes. The controversy ignited during a heated debate on his show the previous night. James had been discussing the increasing influence of conservative figures in politics when the conversation turned to Karoline Leavitt, the rising Republican star whose rapid ascent had both energized her base and drawn fierce criticism from opponents. Known for his sharp rhetoric, James took it a step too far. What was meant as pointed political critique came off as deeply personal and inflammatory. The reaction was swift. Within minutes, clips of his remarks spread like wildfire across social media. Outrage erupted from all sides, and "Whisker Fire James Caldwell" began trending nationwide. The network wasted no time in responding. By morning, James was summoned to an emergency meeting with top executives. The decision was final. His contract was terminated, effective immediately. A carefully crafted press release followed, denouncing his comments and reaffirming the network's commitment to respectful and balanced discourse. Just like that, the company that had once celebrated his bold takes now severed all ties without hesitation. Sitting alone in his dressing room, James stared at his phone, scrolling through the avalanche of reactions. His supporters decried the firing as an attack on free speech, while critics cheered his downfall, calling it overdue. He debated issuing a statement to explain himself, to push back against the narrative spiraling out of his control. But the damage was already done. Sponsors had pulled their support. Former colleagues remained silent, and any attempt to justify his words only seemed to add more fuel to the outrage. By the time he left the building, a wall of reporters and flashing cameras awaited him. Microphones were thrust toward his face. Questions bombarded him from every angle, but he said nothing. He slipped into the back seat of a waiting black sedan, shutting out the noise. As the car pulled away from the studio that had once been his home, he stared out the window, lost in thought. His career had always thrived on controversy, on pushing the limits of political discourse, but now, in just a matter of hours, it had all collapsed. What came next was uncertain. Would he fade into obscurity, another casualty of the ever-intensifying media battleground? Or would he find a way to fight back, to reclaim his voice? For now, there were no answers, only the harsh reality that his future was no longer in his control. The car moved through the crowded streets, the city outside a blur of flashing lights and rushing pedestrians. James leaned back against the seat, his mind racing. Just yesterday, he had been at the top of his game, respected, feared, and admired in equal measure. Now he was radioactive. No network would touch him. No brand would dare associate with him. His reputation had been shattered in real time, and there was no stopping the momentum of his fall. His phone buzzed again. He hesitated before glancing at the screen. A text from his longtime agent, Sarah Reynolds. "Lay low, no statements, let it blow over. Call me when you're ready." He exhaled sharply, resisting the urge to type out a defensive response. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't be torn apart, analyzed, and weaponized against him. Instead, he scrolled through Twitter. Every major news outlet had picked up the story. Some headlines framed it as justice served, while others debated whether cancel culture had gone too far. But what unnerved him the most was how quickly people had turned. Colleagues who once praised his fearless commentary were silent, while others publicly condemned him, distancing themselves with carefully worded statements. Then, a call. Unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "James, it's Mark," a familiar voice said. Mark Linton, his old producer from years ago, now running an independent media startup. "Heard what happened," Mark continued. "Listen. You need to get ahead of this. Come on my show, tell your side. Unfiltered. No network constraints." James pinched the bridge of his nose. Mark, don't decide now, Mark interrupted. But think about it. You can disappear and let them define you, or you can take control of your own damn narrative. The call ended, leaving James with more questions than answers. Did he want to fight, or was it already over? The car slowed to a stop in front of his apartment building. A small group of reporters lingered outside, waiting. He sighed, pulling his hood over his head before stepping out, cameras flashing, voices shouting. For now, he wouldn't speak. Not yet. But deep down, he knew. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. James shut the door behind him, sealing off the noise of the reporters outside. The apartment was dark and silent, a stark contrast to the storm raging online. He tossed his phone onto the kitchen counter and poured himself a drink, staring at the city skyline through the window. He had spent years clawing his way to the top, navigating the brutal world of political media, and now, in a matter of hours, it had all unraveled. His mind circled back to Mark's offer. Going on an independent show meant no corporate leash, no scripted apologies, no PR-crafted damage control, just him speaking directly to the people. But was that the right move, or would it just make things worse? His phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from an old friend in the industry. They're already filling your spot, announcing the replacement tomorrow. They're erasing you. James clenched his jaw. It wasn't just about losing his job. They wanted to make him irrelevant, a cautionary tale for anyone who dared step out of line. He turned on the TV, flipping through channels until he found what he was looking for, his own network. The breaking news banner ran across the bottom of the screen. James Caldwell terminated following controversial remarks on Karoline Leavitt. The anchor, someone he had mentored early in their career, recited a carefully scripted statement about the network's commitment to journalistic integrity. No mention of his years of work. No acknowledgement of the countless times he had driven, ratings through the roof. Just a cold, clinical dismissal. A slow anger simmered inside him. They had built him up when he was useful, only to discard him the second he became a liability. The hypocrisy was staggering. He downed the rest of his drink and picked up his phone. Mark's number was still on the screen. His finger hovered over the call button. This was his moment of choice. Fade away quietly or fight back on his own terms. With a deep breath, he made the call. "I'm in," he said. Mark chuckled on the other end. "Knew you would be. Let's remind them who the hell you are." The next morning, James woke to the relentless buzz of his phone. More headlines, more takes, more speculation. The world was still talking about him, but soon they'd be hearing from him directly. Mark had set everything up. They would record. That evening in an undisclosed studio. No network censors, no scripted PR cleanup, just a raw, unfiltered conversation. It was risky. If he said the wrong thing, he could bury himself even deeper. But if he played it right, he could flip the script. James spent the day pacing his apartment, crafting his message. He knew he couldn't just play the victim. That never worked. He had to own the moment, reframe the conversation, and remind people why they listened to him in the first place. By nightfall, he arrived at the studio, a nondescript warehouse tucked away from the public eye. Mark greeted him at the door, clapping him on the back. "Glad you didn't chicken out," Mark said, leading him inside. James smirked. "Not my style." The setup was simple. A dimly lit stage, 2 chairs, and a single camera. No teleprompters, no producers in his ear. Just him and the audience. Mark settled into his seat across from James. "All right," he said, pressing record. "Let's get into it." James leaned forward, locking eyes with the camera. "I know why you're watching," he began. "You've heard the headlines, you've seen the outrage, but now you're going to hear the truth." And with that, he began. He walked through the events leading up to the controversy, explained his intent, and confronted the hypocrisy of the media machine. He didn't apologize, at least not in the way they wanted. He owned his words, clarified his stance, and challenged those who had turned on him overnight. I built my career on calling out hypocrisy, he said. And now I'm calling it out again. The same people who praised me for being bold now pretend they never knew me. Why? Because I went too far? Or because I stopped being useful to them? Mark nodded. So what's next for James Caldwell? James exhaled, letting the question hang in the air for a moment. I don't know, he admitted. But I do know this. I'm not done. The recording ended. Mark sat back, studying him. That was good, he said. Honest. People are going to talk. Good, James said, standing up. Let them. By the time the interview went live the next morning, it had already gone viral. The mainstream networks tried to ignore it at first, but they couldn't. The conversation had shifted. The same outlets that had written him off now debated whether he was staging a comeback. James watched it all unfold, a slow smirk forming. Maybe his old career was dead. Maybe he'd never get another network gig again. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't need one. The numbers were staggering. Within hours of the interview dropping, it had racked up millions of views. Comments flooded in, some supportive, some skeptical, but one thing was clear. People were listening. James wasn't just a trending topic anymore. He was a movement. Mark called later that night, his voice buzzing with excitement. This thing is blowing up, man. People are pissed, but they're also paying attention. Sponsors are already reaching out. Independent ones. No corporate strings attached. James sat in his darkened apartment, staring at his laptop screen as reactions poured in. The mainstream media was still trying to paint him as a disgraced host clinging to relevance, but outside of that bubble, something different was happening. People were rallying around him, not just as a political commentator, but as a symbol of resistance against the manufactured outrage machine. Another call, this time from Sarah, his agent. He hesitated before answering. James, she said, her voice careful. I've been getting feelers from networks. He raised an eyebrow. Networks? You mean the same ones that threw me under the bus? She sighed. They see the numbers. They see you still have an audience. Some of them are wondering if they made a mistake. James let out a low chuckle. They didn't make a mistake. They did exactly what they always do. Use people, then toss them aside when they become inconvenient. Then Sarah asked, So what do you want to do? James leaned back, considering his options. He could go back. He could negotiate a return, make some kind of half-hearted apology, and reclaim a comfortable seat at the table. But something in him had shifted. They fired me because I didn't fit their script anymore, he said finally. And they want me back because I'm valuable again, but I'm done playing by their rules. Sarah sighed. I figured you'd say that. Then why'd you call? He asked. Because I also figured you might want to build something of your own. That got his attention. I'm listening. There's a new space opening up, she said. Independent media, direct-to-audience platforms. You don't need a network to have influence anymore. You could start your own thing, your own show, your own brand, where no one can cancel you. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Sarah connected James with investors and media strategists who specialized in independent platforms. He spent hours in meetings, reviewing potential formats, and mapping out a strategy. The media landscape was changing, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't answering to a network. He was building his own. Mark was all in. You don't need a legacy network anymore, he told James over coffee one morning. The internet is the great equalizer. Build your own channel, control your own message, you already have the audience. James was skeptical at first. He had spent his career in studios backed by massive production teams and multi-million-dollar advertisers. Could he really do this on his own? But as he watched more and more mainstream figures struggle to stay relevant, while independent voices skyrocketed, he realized Mark was right. By the end of the month, the Caldwell Report was officially in motion. It wasn't just a YouTube channel or a podcast, it was a full-scale independent news and commentary platform. Unfiltered, unscripted, and unapologetic. The first episode was set to stream live. The setup was simple. James sitting at a sleek desk, a single camera trained on him. No teleprompters, no network interference. Just him and the audience. As the countdown timer ticked down, Sarah and Mark stood behind the cameras, watching. The chat was already exploding with thousands of viewers waiting. James took a deep breath, adjusted his mic, and cracked his knuckles. 3, 2, 1. The red light blinked on. James leaned in, looking directly into the lens. "Well," he said with a smirk, "they tried to cancel me. Didn't work." The chat exploded. He continued, his voice steady and confident. "For years I was part of the machine. I played by their rules. Until the moment I stepped out of line and they made an example of me. But here's the thing. They don't control the conversation anymore, you do." He laid it all out. The hypocrisy of the media, the manufactured outrage, the way voices were silenced when they became inconvenient. And then he promised his audience something different. "This is just the beginning," he said. "I'm not here to be a puppet. I'm here to speak the truth. No filters, no censors. And if that makes people uncomfortable, good." By the time he ended the stream, the numbers were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of live viewers, millions of views within hours. More than he had ever pulled on network television. Sarah clapped him on the back. "You just made history," she said. Mark grinned. "And you just made a lot of people very nervous." James exhaled, looking at the monitor as the stream replayed. For the first time in weeks, he felt it. Control. They had tried to erase him. But now, he was bigger than ever.